The sun hadn't even peeked over the hills yet, but the boy was already awake. He sat on the edge of a thin mattress laid directly on the floor, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand. The room was small, so small that if he stretched both arms out, his fingertips would almost touch the walls. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, but he didn't turn it on. Electricity cost money, and money was something they barely had. Outside, the city was beginning to stir. Roosters crowed in the distance, motorbikes sputtered to life, and somewhere down the alley, a vendor started stacking fresh bread on his cart. The boy pulled on his only pair of shoes, scuffed, slightly too big, held together with tape near the sole, and quietly slipped out the door so as not to wake his grandmother. She'd been coughing all night again, a dry, rattling sound that made his chest tighten every time he heard it. He walked quickly through the narrow streets, past laundry lines strung between crumbling buildings and stray dogs curled up in doorways. His destination was the main plaza in the city center, a place full of tourists, office workers, and street vendors. It was also the only place where someone might pay him a few coins to clean their shoes. By the time he reached the plaza, the sun was up, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. He unfolded his small wooden stool, set out his tin of black polish, his rag, and his stiff bristled brush. Everything was worn but clean. He took pride in that. He'd learned early that people didn't just pay for a shine. They paid for trust. If your kit looked messy or dirty, they'd walk right past you. The first customer came just after 8. A man in a wrinkled suit rushing to a meeting, barely looked at him as he plopped down on the stool. "Quick shine," he muttered. The boy nodded, got to work, and finished in under 3 minutes. The man tossed a couple of coins into his tin without counting them and hurried off. It wasn't much, but it was something. The morning passed slowly. Some people ignored him completely. Others gave him a kind smile but said they didn't need a shine. A few kids his age walked by with backpacks, laughing and shoving each other, heading to school. He watched them for a moment, then looked down at his hands, already stained with polish rough from hours of scrubbing leather. School felt like a world away. He hadn't always been like this. 2 years ago, he'd had parents, a real bed, and a school uniform hanging in his closet. But then came the accident. A bus skidding off a mountain road during a rainstorm. No warning, no chance to say goodbye, just silence where their voices used to be. After that, everything changed. His grandmother took him in, but her pension barely covered rent, let alone food or medicine. So he stopped going to school and started working instead. Around noon, a tourist couple stopped in front of his stool. The woman pointed at his kit and said something in a language he didn't understand, but her husband nodded and sat down. The boy cleaned both shoes carefully, making sure every scuff mark disappeared. When he was done, the man smiled, patted his shoulder, and dropped a few colorful bills into the tin, more than he usually made in half a day. The boy's heart leapt. Maybe today would be a good day after all. But the afternoon brought clouds, then a light drizzle. People hurried under awnings or opened umbrellas, and no one wanted to stop for a shoe shine in the rain. He stayed anyway, hunched under a plastic tarp he'd tied between 2 lampposts. His fingers grew numb and his stomach growled, but he didn't leave. If he left, he'd miss the chance that might come. By late afternoon, the rain stopped, but the plaza had emptied. He counted his earnings, enough for a small bag of rice, maybe a few eggs, and, if he was lucky, a single packet of cough syrup for his grandmother. Not enough for the medicine the doctor had prescribed last week, but it would have to do. He packed up slowly, folding the stool, wrapping the brush in an old cloth. As he walked home, the sky turned orange, then purple. Streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows. He passed a bakery where the smell of fresh bread made his mouth water, but he kept walking. He didn't look in the windows of the toy stores or the electronic shops. Those weren't for people like him. Back in their room, his grandmother was sitting by the window, wrapped in a faded shawl. Her eyes lit up when she saw him. "You're home," she said softly. He nodded and set the tin on the table. "I made a little extra today," he said, trying to sound cheerful. She reached out and touched his cheek with her wrinkled hand. "You work too hard, mijo." "I don't mind," he said, though his shoulders ached and his feet throbbed. She didn't argue. She knew as well as he did that there was no other way. They ate a thin soup made from yesterday's leftovers, sharing the last piece of bread. After dinner, he helped her into bed, fluffing her pillow and tucking the blanket around her thin frame. "Sleep well," he whispered. "You too," she murmured, already drifting off. He lay down on his mattress, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the city hummed with life. Music from a nearby bar, laughter from a group of teenagers, the distant wail of a siren. He closed his eyes and imagined a different life, one where he wore a school uniform, carried books instead of a shoe kit, and worried about homework instead of rent. But dreams didn't fill stomachs or buy medicine. Still, he held on to that image as he drifted off. The boy in the uniform, walking into a classroom with his head held high. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it would never happen. But as long as he could picture it, he had something to keep going for. And tomorrow, he'd be back at the plaza before sunrise, brush in hand, hoping for another kind stranger, another lucky break, another day where the coins in his tin added up to just a little more than yesterday. Because in his world, hope wasn't a grand thing. It was small, like a single coin, a warm meal, or a quiet moment with someone who loved you. And sometimes that was enough to keep you going. The next morning came just like the one before, gray light creeping through the cracks in the shutters, the distant sound of a rooster, and the familiar ache in his shoulders from sleeping on the thin mattress. He got up quietly, careful not to disturb his grandmother, who was still asleep, her breathing slower and steadier than it had been the night before. That small improvement made him feel just a little lighter as he tied his shoes and stepped out into the cool air. The walk to the plaza felt longer today. Maybe it was because his legs were tired. Or maybe it was because yesterday's hope had worn thin overnight. He hadn't slept well, tossing and turning with thoughts of how little he'd earned and how much more they needed. But he pushed those thoughts away. Worrying wouldn't clean shoes or fill bellies. Action would. By the time he reached his usual spot near the edge of the plaza, the sun was climbing and the street was already busy. Tourists snapped photos of the colorful buildings. Office workers hurried past with coffee cups in hand, and vendors called out their prices for fresh fruit and empanadas. He set up his stool, arranged his polished tin just so, and waited. The morning passed in the usual rhythm. Some customers, some rejections, a few kind words, a few impatient sighs. He kept his head down, focused on his work, making sure every shoe he touched left his hands looking better than when it arrived. It wasn't just about the coins. It was about pride. Even if the world saw him as just a boy with a brush, he knew he was doing honest work, and that mattered. Around midday, the crowd thinned as people went inside for lunch. He took a small piece of bread from his pocket, the last of yesterday's loaf, and chewed slowly, savoring each bite. He watched the pigeons peck at crumbs near a fountain and wondered if they ever worried about where their next meal would come from. That's when he saw him. A man in a dark gray suit walked toward the plaza from the direction of the nicer hotels. He wasn't rushing like most businessmen. He moved calmly, almost thoughtfully, his polished shoes clicking softly against the stone. The boy tensed slightly. Men like this usually didn't stop for street shiners. They had drivers, assistants, maybe even their own shoe-shine boys in private clubs. But then, to his surprise, the man slowed, looked around, and his eyes landed on the small stool and the tin of polish. Without a word, the man sat down. The boy blinked, then quickly wiped his hands on his pants and stepped forward. "Good afternoon, sir," he said, voice quiet but clear. The man nodded. "Afternoon. You're open?" "Yes, sir." "Then go ahead." The boy knelt and began brushing off the dust from the man's shoes. They were expensive, real leather, perfectly shaped, not a single scuff. Still, he treated them like any other pair, applying just the right amount of polish, working it in with smooth, even strokes. He didn't rush. He never did. After a moment, the man spoke again. "How long have you been doing this?" The boy paused, surprised by the question. Most customers didn't talk to him at all. "About 2 years," he said. "And school? I don't go anymore." The man was silent for a while. Then he asked, "Why not?" The boy kept polishing, his hands steady even though his heart had started to beat a little faster. "My parents passed away," he said simply. "I live with my grandmother now. She's not well. I need to help." The man didn't say "I'm sorry." He didn't offer empty pity. Instead, he asked him, "What's your name?" The boy told him. The man nodded slowly. "You've got good hands. Strong but gentle. That's rare." The boy didn't know what to say to that, so he just kept working. When he finished, he stepped back and held out a clean rag. "All done, sir." The man looked down at his shoes, then at the boy. "You did a fine job." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few bills, more than double what anyone usually paid, and placed them gently in the tin. Then, before standing, he leaned forward slightly. "You have a good heart, too. Don't let the world make you forget that." The boy stood frozen for a second, unsure if he'd heard right. By the time he looked up, the man was already walking away, disappearing into the crowd near the hotel entrance. For the rest of the afternoon, the boy couldn't stop thinking about those words. Good hands, good heart. No one had ever said anything like that to him. People called him kid or shoe boy or sometimes nothing at all. But this man had looked him in the eye, asked his name, and spoken to him like he mattered. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, business slowed again. But this time the boy didn't feel as heavy. There was a strange warmth in his chest, a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, more like being seen. He packed up earlier than usual, his mind full of questions. Who was that man? Did he really mean what he said? And why did it feel like something had shifted, even if just a little? Back at home, his grandmother was sitting by the window, wrapped in her shawl, sipping warm tea. She smiled when he came in. "You're back early." "I had a good day," he said, and for the first time in weeks it felt true. He showed her the extra money, and her eyes softened. "Maybe tomorrow we can get the medicine," she said. "Maybe," he agreed. That night, after helping her into bed and blowing out the single candle they used to save electricity, he lay on his mattress and stared at the ceiling again. But instead of imagining a classroom, he imagined that man's face, calm, kind, serious. And he wondered if people like that really existed in the world, or if he'd just been lucky enough to meet one. He fell asleep with the tin of polish beside him, not just as a tool for earning coins, but as something that, for one brief moment, had connected him to someone who saw him, not as a poor boy on the street, but as a person. And in a world that often felt cold and loud and unfair, that small moment felt like a gift, one he didn't fully understand yet, but one he wouldn't forget. He woke before the sky even thought about turning light. The air was cool and still, the kind of quiet that only comes in the hours just before dawn. His grandmother was breathing softly in the corner, wrapped in her thin blanket, finally sleeping without coughing. That alone made his chest feel a little lighter. He dressed quickly, careful not to make a sound, and slipped out into the street with his shoe kit tucked under his arm. The walk to the plaza felt different this morning. Not because anything had changed, the same cracked sidewalks, the same stray cats darting between trash bins, but because something inside him had shifted. Ever since the man in the gray suit spoke to him, a tiny spark had been glowing in his chest. It wasn't hope in the loud, shouting kind of way. It was quieter, like the first note of a song you've almost forgotten but suddenly remember. He didn't expect anything to happen. He knew better than that, but for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't entirely made of hard edges and closed doors. He reached the plaza just as the streetlights flickered off. The cobblestones were damp from the night's dew, and the air smelled like wet earth and fresh bread from the bakery down the block. He unfolded his stool, set out his polish tin, and waited. But he didn't wait long. As he bent to tie his shoelace, a low hum caught his ear. Not the usual sputter of motorbikes or the rumble of delivery trucks. This was deeper, smoother, like the purr of something powerful and expensive. He looked up. At first he thought he was dreaming. Down the street, rounding the corner with slow, deliberate grace, came a black car. Not just any car, long, sleek, with windows so dark they looked like mirrors. It rolled to a stop right across from his spot. Then another came behind it, a silver one, low to the ground, gleaming even in the dim light. Then a third, a fourth, a fifth, 5 cars, all expensive, all parked neatly along the curb one after another, like they'd been placed there on purpose. His heart started pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Men in crisp white shirts and dark trousers stepped out from the front and back seats, not rushing, not talking loudly. They stood beside the cars, scanning the street with calm eyes like guards or assistants. One of them held a small radio to his ear. The boy froze. His hands gripped the edge of his stool. Was this some kind of mistake? Were they looking for someone else? He glanced around, half expecting to see a film crew or a parade or something that would explain this strange scene. But the plaza was empty except for him and the cars. Then the door of the lead car, The black one, opened. Out stepped the man in the gray suit. He looked just as he had yesterday, calm, clean-shaven, wearing the same quiet confidence like a second skin. He walked across the street, his polished shoes clicking softly against the stone, and stopped just a few feet away. He didn't smile right away. He just looked at the boy as if making sure he was real. Then he smiled. "Good morning." The boy couldn't speak. His mouth was dry. He managed a small nod. The man stepped closer. "I told you we'd be here for you. We?" The boy finally whispered, his voice barely louder than the breeze. The man gestured to the cars, to the men standing by them. "My team, my company, and me." He paused, then added gently, "You didn't think I'd forget what I saw yesterday, did you?" The boy shook his head, still stunned. I didn't think anything would happen." "That's because you've been taught to expect the worst," the man said, not unkindly. "But sometimes the world surprises you." One of the men in uniform approached with a small thermos and 2 cups. He poured steaming coffee into one and handed it to the man in the suit, then offered the other to the boy. The boy hesitated, then took it. The warmth spread through his fingers, real and grounding. "I run a company," the man said, sipping his coffee. "We make shoes, good ones, sold all over the country. We also believe that talent doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it wears worn-out sneakers and works before sunrise." He looked down at the boy's hands. "You've got skill, discipline, and something even rarer, dignity. That's not something you can teach in a classroom." The boy stared into his coffee, not sure what to say. No one had ever called him dignified before. "I spoke with the school last night," the man continued. "There's a place for you. Starting today. Full scholarship, books, uniform, meals, everything." "And your grandmother?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. "This covers her medicine for the next 3 months, plus a little extra for rent." The boy's eyes filled with tears. He blinked hard, trying to hold them back, but one escaped and rolled down his cheek. He wiped it quickly with his sleeve. "You don't have to answer right now," the man said softly, "but the car's waiting. The school opens in an hour, and your first class is math." The boy looked past him, at the black car, its door held open by a quiet man in a white shirt. He thought of his grandmother, still asleep in their tiny room. He thought of the empty school desk he'd imagined so many nights. He thought of his hands stained with polish and how they might one day hold a pen instead. He took a deep breath. Then he stood up, set his coffee cup carefully on the stool, and picked up his shoe kit. Not to use it, but to put it away. "For now, I'm ready," he said. The man nodded, as if he'd known all along. As they walked toward the car, the boy glanced back one last time at his little stool, his tin of polish, the spot where he'd spent so many hours trying to earn just enough to survive. It wasn't shame he felt, it was gratitude. That stool had kept them alive. But today, something new was beginning. He slid into the back seat of the car. It smelled like leather and quiet. The door closed behind him with a soft, solid click like the turning of a page. Outside, the sun finally broke over the rooftops, spilling golden light across the plaza. And for the first time in a long time, the boy didn't feel like he was chasing the light. He was walking into it. The car ride felt like floating through a dream. The seats were soft, the windows tinted just enough to blur the outside world into streaks of color and light. He sat perfectly still, hands resting on his lap, his old shoe kit beside him like a quiet companion from another life. Every now and then he'd glance out the window and see familiar streets. The market where he'd once begged for day-old bread, the alley where he'd hidden during a sudden downpour, the bus stop where he'd waited hours for a ride that never came. But today he wasn't walking. He wasn't waiting. He was moving forward, carried by something he still couldn't quite name. The man in the gray suit sat beside him, not talking much, just letting the silence settle like a blanket. Every so often he'd point out a building or a park, explaining its history in a calm, steady voice. It wasn't to impress, he wasn't that kind of man. It was as if he wanted the boy to see the city not as a place of struggle, but as a place full of stories, including his own. When they arrived at the school, the boy's stomach twisted. It wasn't like any school he'd ever seen. Tall trees lined the entrance, their leaves rustling in the morning breeze. Students in crisp uniforms walked in pairs or small groups, laughing, carrying books, some even sipping juice from cartons. He looked down at his own clothes, faded shirt, patched pants, shoes held together by hope and tape. and felt a wave of doubt. But before he could say anything, the man placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "You belong here," he said, as if reading his thoughts. "Not because I said so, because you've earned it." Inside the school office, a kind-faced woman greeted them with a warm smile. She already had a folder with his name on it, his real name written in neat letters. She handed him a uniform, white shirt, navy pants, black shoes, brand new, unworn, waiting just for him. In another room, a nurse checked his height and weight, asked about his health, and gave him a small packet of vitamins. No one looked at him with pity. No one whispered. They treated him like any other student, like he was supposed to be there. His grandmother arrived an hour later, wrapped in her best shawl, leaning on a borrowed cane. Her eyes were wide with disbelief as she stepped into the school courtyard. The man had sent a car for her, too, along with a doctor who'd examined her that morning and promised to refill her prescriptions. She held the boy's hand tightly as they walked through the halls, her fingers trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from joy. "I never thought I'd see this day," she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. At lunchtime, he sat at a long table in the cafeteria, surrounded by kids who didn't know his story. One boy asked where he'd gone to school before. He hesitated, then simply said, "I worked for a while." The boy nodded as if that made perfect sense and passed him a banana. No questions, no judgment, just kindness. That afternoon, his first class began. Math. The teacher wrote equations on the board, and for a moment the boy panicked. He'd forgotten so much. But then he remembered how he used to count coins in his head, calculate how many shines he needed for rice or medicine. Numbers weren't strangers to him. They were old friends, just dressed differently. After school, the man didn't take him back to the plaza. Instead, they drove to a quiet neighborhood with small houses and flower boxes in the windows. There, in a modest but clean apartment above a tailor's shop, they'd arranged a new home for him and his grandmother, closer to the school, safer, with running water that didn't taste like rust. The landlord, a gentle woman with silver hair, handed them the keys and said, "Welcome. You'll be safe here." That night, as he lay in a real bed for the first time in years, sheets clean, pillow soft, he listened to his grandmother humming a lullaby in the next room. Outside, the city sounds were different here, quieter, gentler. No shouting, no screeching brakes, just the occasional dog bark and the whisper of wind through the trees. He thought about the shoe kit sitting in the corner of the room. He hadn't thrown it away. He couldn't. It wasn't just a tool, it was proof that he'd survived. That he'd kept going when everything felt impossible. And now it would sit there as a reminder, not of what he'd lost, but of how far he'd come. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. Mornings began with breakfast, real meals, not just bread and water. He walked to school with other students, learning their names, sharing jokes, slowly becoming part of something bigger than himself. Afternoons were for homework, for asking questions, for discovering that he actually liked reading. That history wasn't just dates, but stories of people who'd fought and dreamed just like him. On weekends, he visited the man's factory, not as a worker, but as a guest. He watched how shoes were designed, stitched, polished. He asked questions about business, about how decisions were made, about how one person could help so many. The man never gave him easy answers. Instead, he said, "Watch, learn, then decide what kind of person you want to be." And the boy did. He studied harder than anyone in his class. Not to impress, but because he knew this chance was rare, precious. He helped his grandmother with her medicine, made sure she ate well, sat with her every evening as she told stories about his parents, stories he'd been too young to remember. One evening, as they sat on their small balcony watching the sunset, his grandmother turned to him and said, "You shine brighter now than any shoe you ever cleaned." He smiled but didn't answer. Because he knew the truth. The shine wasn't his alone. It came from the kindness of a stranger, the strength of his grandmother, the quiet courage it took to keep showing up, even when the world felt heavy. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, he made a silent promise. One day, he would be the one sitting on a bench, noticing a boy with tired eyes and rough hands, and he would say the words that changed everything. "You have good hands, and a good heart, because that's how light spreads." Not in grand gestures, but in small, human moments, passed from one soul to another like a coin, like a cup of coffee, like a seat in a car on a quiet morning. 10 years had passed, but the plaza hadn't changed much. The same cobblestones, the same fountain with its chipped edge, the same buzz of voices in the morning air. Tourists still snapped photos, vendors still called out their prices, and near the old bench under the fig tree, a new boy sat with a wooden stool and a tin of polish, just like he once had. He watched from a distance, hands in his pockets, wearing a crisp shirt and dark trousers but no tie. He never wore ties anymore, said they felt too much like chains. He wasn't here for business. He wasn't even supposed to be here at all, not officially. His office was across town, in a modern building with glass walls and a view of the mountains. But every Friday, without fail, he made time for this. For the plaza. For the kids who reminded him of himself. Today he walked over slowly, not to inspect, not to judge, just to sit. The boy looked up, wary at first, then relaxed when he saw the gentle smile. "Shine, sir?" the boy asked, voice thin but proud. He nodded and sat on the stool. "Please." As the boy worked, brushing, polishing, wiping with careful hands, he watched him closely. Saw the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way he bit his lip when a scuff wouldn't come off, the way his shoes were 2 sizes too big, held together with frayed laces. It was like looking into a mirror from another life. "You're good at this," he said quietly. The boy glanced up, surprised. "Thanks. How long have you been doing it?" "Since my mom got sick." "About 8 months," he nodded. "And school?" "Not right now." The words hung in the air, heavy and familiar. He remembered that exact feeling, the shame mixed with necessity, the quiet resignation that came when dreams had to be folded up and tucked away to make room for survival. When the shine was done, he didn't just hand over coins. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a school application form, already filled out with the boy's name. Someone had been watching, quietly gathering details. There was also a letter of recommendation signed by him and a note that read, "Your first month is covered. All you have to do is show up." The boy stared at it, confused. "What's this?" "A chance," he said simply. "Like someone once gave me." He didn't tell the whole story, not yet. Stories like that needed trust, and trust took time. But he left his business card on the stool before walking away. On the back he'd written in pen, "Come see me Monday. Bring your questions, and your grandmother, if she's with you." Back at the office, his assistant greeted him with a stack of reports. "The youth program enrollment is up 40% this quarter," she said, smiling. 3 of your students got scholarships to university." He nodded, but his mind was still at the plaza. That program, his proudest work, wasn't just about teaching shoe repair or tailoring or carpentry. It was about dignity, about showing kids that their hands could build a future, not just beg for scraps. Every apprentice got school support, health checkups, and a small stipend so their families wouldn't suffer while they learned. No one had to choose between eating and dreaming. Later that afternoon, he visited the factory, the same one where he'd spent his first summer break years ago, sweeping floors and watching how leather was cut and stitched. Now he oversaw operations, but he still walked the floor daily, talking to workers, listening to ideas. Many of them were former street kids, now skilled artisans with steady pay and health insurance. Some even trained the next generation. One of them, a young woman with bright eyes and calloused fingers, stopped him near the finishing line. "Senor," she said, holding up a pair of hand-stitched boots, "these are for your collection. We made them just like you asked. Simple, strong, no logo." He ran his hand over the leather, smooth, honest, just like the work behind it. "Thank you," he said. "I'll wear them every Friday." Because every Friday he returned to the plaza, not as a boss, not as a success story, but as a reminder. A living proof that one act of kindness can ripple outward for years, touching lives in ways you never imagined. That evening he went home, not to a mansion, but to a modest house on a quiet street where his grandmother still lived, now in her 80s, her cough long gone, her spirit bright. She was in the kitchen, humming as she stirred a pot of soup. She turned when he entered, her face lighting up. "You smell like polish again," she teased. He laughed. "Old habits." She handed him a bowl and sat across from him at the small wooden table, the same one they'd carried from their old apartment, now worn smooth with time and love. "You know," she said after a while, "I still keep your old shoe kit. In the closet, I know," he said softly. "I saw it last week. It's not rusted," she added proudly. I clean it every month, he smiled. That kit wasn't just a relic. It was a compass. It reminded him where he'd started, so he'd never forget why he kept going. Later, as he sat on the porch watching fireflies blink in the dusk, he thought about the boy at the plaza. Would he come Monday? Would he be scared? Would he believe that a better life was possible? He hoped so. But even if the boy didn't, he'd keep showing up. Because change didn't always happen in one grand moment. Sometimes it took many small ones, like a clean pair of shoes, a warm meal, a listening ear, a seat offered without judgment. Years ago, a man in a gray suit had seen him not as a problem to ignore, but as a person worth believing in. And that single act had rewritten his entire story. Now it was his turn. He didn't need fame or headlines. He didn't need to be called a hero. All he wanted was to make sure that when another child sat on a folding stool with tired eyes and rough hands, anyone would stop, look them in the eye, and say, "You matter." Because in the end, that's what changed everything. Not money, not cars, not even schools. It was being seen. And as the night deepened and the city lights flickered on one by one, he knew his work wasn't finished. It never would be. But that was okay. Because every time he helped one more kid stand a little taller, the world became a little kinder. And that was enough. The rain came softly that Friday, just a light mist. The kind that clings to your skin like a memory. He stood under the awning of the old bookstore near the plaza, watching the street fill with people rushing for cover. Umbrellas popped open like black flowers and the cobblestones darkened with wet shine. But one figure didn't move. It was the boy from last week, the one he'd given the envelope to. He was still at his spot, hunched over his stool trying to shield his polished tin with a plastic bag. His shoes were soaked, his shirt clinging to his thin shoulders. He hadn't come to the office on Monday, or Tuesday, or any day since. For a moment, disappointment flickered in his chest. Maybe the boy hadn't believed him. Maybe fear had won. Maybe life had gotten in the way. Medicine bills, a sick relative, another mouth to feed. He knew how quickly hope could drown in the weight of daily survival. But then he saw it. Tucked under the boy's arm, wrapped in the same plastic bag, was a school notebook. And as a businessman paused to shake water from his coat, the boy quickly wiped his shoes. Not for coins, but because the man looked tired, and his shoes were muddy. It was a small thing, a quiet thing, but it spoke volumes. He stepped out from under the awning, ignoring the rain, and walked over. The boy looked up, startled. "Sir, I wanted to come, but my little sister got a fever in the clinic." "It's okay," he said gently, crouching so they were eye level. "You don't owe me an explanation." The boy swallowed hard, eyes glistening, not just from rain. "I read the letter. Every night I just didn't think someone like me could really go." "Someone like you?" he repeated softly. "Hardworking, honest, willing to help even when you have nothing? That's exactly who belongs." He reached into his coat and pulled out a dry folder. Inside were new forms, a bus pass and a note from the school principal welcoming him personally. "They've held your spot," he said, "and we've arranged for your sister to see a doctor at the community clinic, free of charge. Your grandmother can go with her." The boy's hands trembled as he took the folder. "Why are you doing this?" "Because once someone saw me. Not my shoes, not my rags, not my empty pockets, but me. And that changed everything." He paused, then added, "Now I get to pass it on. That's how kindness works. It doesn't end. It grows." The rain slowed to a drizzle. Around them, the plaza came back to life. Vendors unfolding tarps, tourists shaking off umbrellas, children laughing as they jumped in puddles. Life, messy and beautiful, kept moving. Over the next few months, he didn't just enroll the boy in school. He made sure someone checked in quietly without pressure. A tutor from the youth program began visiting their home twice a week. A seamstress from the factory mended the family's clothes. And every Friday, without fail, he'd stop by the plaza not for a shine, but to sit and talk about homework, about dreams, about how hard it was to feel like you didn't belong. One afternoon, the boy shyly handed him a drawing. It showed two figures, one small, polishing shoes, the other taller, standing beside him with a hand on his shoulder. Above them, in careful letters, it read, "He saw me." He kept that drawing in his office, pinned to the wall beside photos of his first factory team and his grandmother's handwritten recipes. Years passed, as they always do. The boy graduated high school, then studied engineering at a technical college, funded by a scholarship from the very company that once made shoes. He never forgot where he came from. On weekends, he volunteered at the youth center, teaching math to kids who worked the streets. And sometimes when the sun was just right, he'd bring his old shoe kit and show them how to make leather gleam, not because they needed to, but because it taught patience, pride, and care. One evening, long after the city lights had come on, the two of them sat on a bench near the fountain, the same one that had watched the boys first shine all those years ago. "You know," the younger one said, "I used to think success meant never having to clean shoes again." "And now?" the older man asked. "Now I think success means choosing when to clean them and why." He smiled. "Sometimes I still do it. For my little sister's school shoes. For my grandmother's Sunday pair. It's not about money anymore. It's about love," the older man nodded. That was the lesson he'd hoped they'd all learn. That dignity isn't found in what you escape, but in what you carry forward with grace. Back at the factory, things had changed too. The youth program had grown into a national initiative with workshops in 5 cities. Former street kids now ran training sessions, designed products, even mentored new apprentices. The company no longer just sold shoes, it built futures. And every pair came with a small tag that read, "Made with care by someone who once had nothing and was given a chance." His grandmother, now in her 90s, still lived with him. Her hands were frail, but her voice was strong. Every Sunday, she cooked a big pot of soup and invited a few of the program's students to eat with them. "Food tastes better when shared," she'd say, ladling broth into chipped but clean bowls. One Sunday, a quiet girl with braided hair sat at the table, barely speaking. After dinner, she pulled the older man aside. "My brother says I should quit school," she whispered. "He says I'm needed at home." He didn't offer money right away. Instead, he asked, "What do you want?" She looked down, then up, eyes fierce. "To be a teacher." "Then that's what you'll be," he said. "And your brother?" "We'll find him work at the workshop, something that pays fairly so you both can breathe." That night, as he walked her to the bus stop, he realized something. The circle wasn't just complete. It was multiplying. He no longer waited for grand moments of change. He found them in small things. The relieved sigh of a mother who could finally afford medicine. The proud grin of a teen holding their first paycheck. The quiet thank you from a child who finally believed they mattered. And every Friday morning, without fail, he still returned to the plaza. Not because he had to, but because it grounded him. Reminded him that real change doesn't roar, it whispers. In a clean pair of shoes. In a held open door. In a single sentence that says, "I see you." As the years rolled on, people would ask him how he stayed humble, how he kept his heart soft in a world that often rewarded hardness. He'd just smile and say, "I remember what it felt like to be invisible, and I never want anyone to feel that way again." The rain had long stopped. The plaza glistened under the streetlights. Somewhere, a new boy unfolded his stool, hoping for a coin, a kind word, a chance, and somewhere nearby, a man in a simple shirt walked toward him, not with pity, but with purpose. Because the story never really ends, it just finds new hands to carry it forward.